Hey everybody, this is Christian. Real quick before we get started, just a quick show note. We did record this podcast for this week while I was traveling. So the podcast was actually, on my end, recorded in a hotel room in Egypt. So the recording, the sound quality is a little bit lower than what our normal recording standards have been for the past few months. But I think it's still a good show. I think it still sounds pretty good. But if you hear a little bit of an echo, a little bit of tapping from the microphone that I was using at the time, that's why Tony and I are still working on some of the logistics of recording a podcast remotely, and we're continuing to get better. So thanks for listening, as always, and we'll get started.
Regulated.
1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4.
This podcast focuses on regulatory and corporate developments in highly regulated spaces. I'm Christian Bax, and I used to regulate medical marijuana.
I'm Tony Glover, and I used to regulate alcoholic beverages and casino gambling. Now together, we're regulated. All right, Christian, let's jump right into it this week. What are we talking about?
Let's do it. We're talking about Kratom, or as our American brothers and sisters call it, Kratom. And it's a drug that's readily available throughout the U.S. right now, and it's come into some interesting news in the last couple of weeks.
Yeah, and Kratom is a substance, especially our listeners in Florida. I'm sure you've driven past a Kratom bar, a kava bar, places that sell different herbal extracts. You'll find this product frequently in smoke shops, vape shops sometimes, also in health food stores, supplement stores, independent stores like that. So this is a product that's definitely on the streets in Florida. And the reason this came to our attention is something I think we've both been watching for a couple years. But there's been 2 recent overdose-related deaths that really brought Kratom into focus. One involved a Pinellas County caretaker whose patient died while the caretaker slept off a large dose. And the other involved a driver becoming unconscious in Pennsylvania and being involved in a crash on a turnpike there. So I've got some key takeaways. They're all drawn from Talia Kirkland's September 27th piece from foxnews.com. But here's kind of what we know right now. Kratom is an herbal extract from an evergreen tree found in South Asia, and it's got some interesting effects at different dosage levels. At a low dose, it actually acts as a stimulant, and at a higher dose, users claim that it reduces pain and that it brings on euphoria. But at a very high dose, it kind of flips around and starts acting as a sedative. So it's kind of got interesting properties. Now, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration has not approved this substance, and they've warned that the active ingredient may expose users to the risk of addiction, abuse, and dependence. And in fact, it actually recommends that Kratom be classified as an opioid. And part of that is because it's believed to act on opioid receptors in the brain. But despite claims from some users that it can be used to treat opioid withdrawal symptoms, the FDA has warned that there's no reliable evidence connecting those two things. So back in 2016, the DEA tried to reclassify Kratom as a Schedule I drug, which would put it on the same level as heroin, cocaine, etc. In Alabama, Arkansas, Indiana, Rhode Island, Vermont, and Wisconsin have already banned it. Now, just looking at the lobbying side, because that's what we do, back in 2014, there was an American Kratom Association that was founded. They say that there's nearly 5 million Kratom users nationwide. They're based in Virginia, and they actively lobby to keep the product on shelves. So there is an advocacy component here as well.
Right. I think that there's an association for pretty much every one of these interesting drugs that are coming up in the news these days. Didn't we talk about the association for the toad drug people?
Yeah. Right.
Okay,
right.
So, yeah, I mean, I looked those guys up on Twitter. I followed it. The feed is exactly what you would expect an association for. Are we going to call it Kratom? Funny story. I looked this when I was researching. The first video I clicked on was Joe Rogan's podcast, and Joe Rogan had Hamilton Morris on there, who is kind of a giant right now in the whole psychedelic movement. He has a show called Hamilton's Pharmacopoeia, which is like a TV show.
Yeah, he's on Vice.
Yeah. He's really good. He's very calm and understated, but he's a smart dude. Anyway, so He called it Kratom, and he was very careful about it because it's how they say it in Thailand, where it's from Southeast Asia. But Joe Rogan's obviously calling it Kratom through the whole discussion. And so the discussion opens with Hamilton Morris is like, so I was at this conference and I was talking about drug policy and we touched on Kratom. Are you familiar with it? And Joe Rogan's like, I'm on it right now. It's like, yeah, man, I hurt my knee last week. It's been killing me. And so I've been taking 6.5 ounces of Kratom every day in order to get through the day. And he had the exact same results from Kratom that you mentioned, where
Right.
it's a slight stimulant. He described it helped with his pain. But I'm looking at the advocacy side. It's exactly what you would expect. It's any time that there's a negative story, pushback on potential health effects of Kratom, it pushes back very aggressively. It's not a whole lot of balancing,
Right.
but I guess you wouldn't expect that from an industry association, right? Especially one that's kind of under fire at the moment.
Well, and going back to the pronunciation note, we're just a couple of country lawyers in North Florida, so we'll say Kratom, and any of our more enlightened listeners in San Francisco or Milan want to say Kratom or whatever other pronunciation, they can do that. So
it's an evolution. As the American lexicon matures on this issue, we will mature as well. But for now, we're going to speak what the people speak about this drug.
Right. So I already mentioned the 2 recent overdose related deaths. Let's look at a few other recent events that have surrounded this substance. A government report released in April said that Kratom was a cause in 91 overdose deaths in 27 American states. Officials had previously said that they knew of 44 deaths. So there's something happening here. Also in April, FDA released an analysis that found significant levels of lead in nickel concentrations. So what their conclusion from that is that long-term use could develop heavy metal poisoning, which could cause serious issues involving the nervous system, kidney damage, anemia, high blood pressure, and increased risk of certain cancers. So that's not great. And also earlier this year, the substance was linked to, a case of Salmonella. So there's some supply chain issues here, both on sort of the health aspect, the Salmonella and whatever's placed into it. Also, there's a concentration issue. I think people are having problems taking the right dose to achieve their desired gains.
Yeah, that Salmonella story actually was really interesting. It has a Florida tie to it as well. So there was,
of course,
as you mentioned, the supply chain. It's always so interesting in these lawsuits because they're a true federal issue in the sense that it's a multi-state supply chain. And so you had a girl from North Dakota I'm not sure if she bought directly or had it shipped to her, but bought Kratom products from a distributor in Colorado. But the origin of the product was actually a St. Petersburg company, St. Petersburg, Florida. Everything seems like ends up getting tied back to Florida.
Right. Well, so looking at some of that data and some of those recent results, again, the report stated that there's been 91 overdose deaths across 27 states. So it doesn't appear to be an isolated situation. My question for you, Christian, is, do you think this is a crisis yet?
No, not really. And one of the reasons why Salmonella is an acute issue that was really brought into the light by some extremely talented attorneys who are over on the West Coast. The one of the co-counsels on that case is known as the food manufacturing, the Salmonella plaintiff's injury lawyer. And so when you look at the actual numbers of the 91 overdose deaths, what the other side of that is frequently pushed back, as the Kratom Association will push back, is that very few of those are isolated to just Kratom. Most of those people who have those overdose deaths have multiple drugs, have entire drug cocktails in their system when they die. And so there's not a one-to-one link. Not to mention, this stuff is everywhere. And you know how I feel about buying medical products, anything, whether it's to get off opioids or for pain relief, buying nutraceuticals or natural products, whatever it may be, from gas stations in order to treat your medical conditions is just never a good idea.
Right.
And that's where we are here. So doesn't seem to be acutely deadly at the moment. And it seems to be relatively ubiquitous. So if the FDA was going to step in, it seems like they would have just crushed this thing a year or two ago, rather than letting it expand to the degree that it has. What do you think? Where is your regulator meter on this crisis at the moment?
I think it has a little bit more to go before it's a full-blown crisis. And it's easy to tell in these circumstances. I might talk about some old examples, but we have a news media, particularly local news, that is highly incentivized to run stories like this, where there's a new scary substance that's causing adverse effects, or they can claim that it's causing adverse effects. Look at how much news coverage Flakka got, for instance, and
Right.
synthetic cannabinoids. And there are some colorful stories and some tragic stories related to that. You look at something like Loko, which was extremely loosely connected to 1 or 2 deaths before the FDA ban came in play. And that was driven, in my opinion, by local news hyping the story up. So we have a news media that's hypersensitive to these issues. And the fact that this hasn't taken over the headlines shows that it may well be a public health crisis at some level. I'm not a doctor and I'm not a public health official, but from a public affairs standpoint, it certainly hasn't broken through the consciousness yet. But, we keep on bringing up the supply chain. And you mentioned that one of the prominent figures in the products liability plaintiffs bar sort of nationwide has brought suit on the Salmonella related case. I mean, it's a great time to be a products liability attorney in the country. I mean, the products that are on the shelves, I mean, people are going to have to pay the bill because you have very sophisticated plaintiffs attorneys. You've got some great defense attorneys too, including at my old firm, Carlton Fields. They've got a great products liability team there. I don't know if you can afford one if you're a small manufacturer distributor. So there's going to be some pain coming down on folks that are trafficking on this. And it's not going to be great. It might be great for the lawyers, but it's not going to be great for the industry. So let me turn to the next question about this burgeoning industry with where we're at right now with the deaths and adverse effects and litigation going on. Do you think that the Kratom industry can survive this?
I do but for a strange reason. So if you had told me this story 6 or 7 years ago, I would have said, no, this is clearly a public health issue.
Right.
We're in uncharted territories. The feds are going to come in. They're going to either crack down or slow this thing down until everyone gets a handle on what potential health impacts would be for widespread recreational use of this product. But 2019 going to 2020, it's just a different world. And from just a practically speaking mindset, I don't see Kratom being the canary in the coal mine. I don't see this shift from sketchy things being bought in gas station to be halted and for the pendulum to swing the other way on Kratom. Specifically, I just don't think it's that big of the risk has been proven to be acute enough or significant enough. And then the other thing that just keeps kind of sitting in the back of my mind when I'm reading these stories is this has been a thing now for 2 or 3 years. And so the feds and state regulators have had a chance to put the hammer down on this. And it seems like they haven't. And one of the reasons, which we'll talk about a little bit later, is because the Kratom has actually adapted to some of the regulatory pressure by a lot of these Kratom distributors. That when you buy the package, it says not for human consumption on the package. It says it's ostensibly supposed to be used to make soaps or some other ancillary use rather than direct human consumption. And so they know what people are using this for. They know that they're consuming it.
I don't know how an illusory disclaimer, small print disclaimer on a product, I don't know how effective that would be to a great products liability attorney. But I also don't work in that area. But it's interesting.
So you know what this reminds me a little bit of is unfiltered, unpasteurized milk,
right?
Where it's sold purely for, pet consumption. It's not, the grocery stores can't sell you this for human consumption. You're not supposed to be able to buy from a regulated grocery chain milk that's come in, it's unfiltered, unpasteurized because it could potentially be carrying some kind of pathogen. That's what people do. Like people who are vegan or who are super, natural, they go in, they say, yes, this is for my pets. They take it home and then they drink it to get around that.
I think they hired a lobbyist. I can't remember who, but I feel like I was in a committee room. I know this issue came up at the legislature, but I feel like both sides are represented. So whoever that is, shout out to you for landing that client.
Right. So I think with this type of thing, these consumable products that's skirting this line between a drug and a food and a nutritional supplement, if they're not actively killing people, it seems like the modus operandi of regulators these days is that, it seems like they err on the side of not arresting people, of not doing this national crackdown. And it just seems like they have other things to pay attention to and do. And so that's why I just don't see a pragmatic risk unless something changes and there's a high profile death that's purely attributed to Kratom. That's not kind of someone was on Kratom and they forgot about somebody else and that led to, kind of this negligent situation. What do you think?
Well, I think we both agree that this is a contingent situation, right? That the industry needs everything to go well because poor timing, there could be one death. And again, I keep on going back to the Four Loko example because the primary death engaged in that led to the FDA ban of Four Loko was, I believe it was a teenager or young person, 21, 22-year-old. And I want to say Michigan, somewhere in the Midwest, who had a heart issue, I believe, died of mysterious circumstances. And in their apartment or home, amongst pizza boxes and laundry and mail and sodas and beers and trash and everything else that you would have in a home, right? All your household products. There was an empty can of Four Loko, as I recall it, right? And the fact that somebody died on a property, on a parcel that had an empty can of Four Loko was enough to connect that product to the death and lead to serious repercussions for the manufacturers. I mean, they had to change their formula and the product is not as attractive now as a juicy juice drink, right? With alcohol as it was before with a strong juice flavored drink with high alcohol content, with also that added caffeine hit to it as well. So, they're on at a very delicate point, in my opinion. But, maybe that's a good time for us to zoom out a little bit, Christian, and look at where the industry is right now.
It's growing. It's has a pretty large market throughout the United States. As we mentioned, it's readily available at gas stations, in head shops. If you walk by places that sell ancillary products for cannabis consumption or for tobacco consumption, frequently you will see the big glowing neon signs that say Kratom on it because they're available in those stores. There was a story that I read out of Westword that basically came from a quote where this reporter was talking to a producer in Indonesia. And he said, I send about 10 tons of Kratom a month. And so that surprised the reporter. And then the reporter basically goes,
it surprised me. Jesus.
Yeah. So this reporter, and I should name the reporter. So Michael Roberts goes and, is talking to people who are in the Kratom field, who he calls Kratom entrepreneurs and who are distributors. And that number seemed to jive with everyone. Where the market is for Kratom is on the upswing. There are tons and tons of this stuff coming in to the US. So much, logistical companies that are moving Kratom and Kratom products around the country they have stuff on back order. They are trying to fill their supply chain in order to serve the demand. And that ranges from finely chopped up leaves to the actual processed pills, which tend to be how that's consumed by people. And so it basically says that this is an important thing for us to all think about because this is not, again, something that's going away. This is something that's growing. It's something that is very widely used in Southeast Asia. And so specifically just in the US, we have a large Southeast Asian population. If it was just in those populations where this is, which it's not, but if it was just those populations, it would be a pretty widespread use in the US. And then, it gets into what we talked a little bit about, which is that it's a mixed bag with Kratom because I will say one of the comparisons that you made to Four Loko is interesting because it does combine two chemicals that will kill you. That there's no debate that if you overdose on caffeine or you overdose on alcohol, individually they can kill you. And whereas there's debate about whether or not kratom will by itself will just stone cold kill you. Although I will say I think that reasonable heads will prevail that if the understanding is that if you do take too much of this stuff, which is a very, very significant amount, it will start causing your systems in your body to start malfunctioning, which could kill you.
Well, and this is a problem too with the misclassification of certain substances. When I hear that the DEA moved to reclassify kratom as a Schedule 1, initially that sounds very grave. But then when you step back at it, and again, I haven't looked at their detailed justification for proposing that reclassification, but just looking at it from the surface, you look at Schedule 1 and there's some serious products in there, but also marijuana's in there. So the fact that they've misclassified some substances makes the public a little skeptical about other substances.
As they should be. The way that Schedule 1 is defined and the way it's been implemented has been extremely problematic because it's a very harsh standard in the sense that it has to have a very high propensity for abuse and it has to have no medicinal value. But you look at the way it's used in Southeast Asia, you run into this situation where it doesn't seem to be acutely deadly and it does have a demonstrable medical use. And so it seems like the proper thing here, right, is if it's causing problems socially, not socially, it's causing problems in the mass market, the FDA should reschedule and make it a Schedule 1. But practically, as you mentioned, it's just a system that doesn't seem to be working very well right now in 2019. So, Tony, one of the other things from the Westworld stories, it points out that Denver, which currently requires kratom sold within city limits to bear a label stressing that it shouldn't be consumed, is really right now, like in Colorado, and specifically in Denver, is being marketed as an ingredient for making soap or candles. Like, can you talk a little bit about your regulatory heartburn? Does that seem like a tenable situation to you?
No, it's not tenable, and the reason is, we're in this position because of years of badly designed drug regulation, but we can't continue to regulate substances based on lies, and that goes to Schedule 1, where we clearly have products that have medicinal effects that are sitting in Schedule 1 for no good reason. And I'm talking about marijuana. And now we have local ordinances dealing with kratom that is acknowledging the lie. There's no scenario. I have to imagine that the majority of kratom products moved in Denver are immediately being used to consume, put into a tea, etc. So again, going back to my point from a product liability standpoint, a sticker on a box doesn't impress me. And I don't think that's the best way to regulate it. But at the same, I would almost, it's a half measure. And I don't blame the city. They have to deal with the hand of cards that they've been dealt, right? But it's not I wouldn't like that as a nationwide solution, no.
This goes back to what we've been talking, some of the themes that we've talked about before, which is specifically with entheogenic plants and psilocybin and cannabis to a degree, where there are Republican form of government where we have multiple layers of administrative and lawmaking entities in government, right? So we've got local governments, state governments, and federal governments, where there are some things that from a policy level are smart to have laboratories where there are experimentation, right? And there are maybe some places where that experimentation should only go so far down into into government. And we can have a debate about whether or not drug policy should be set at the state level versus at a federal level, considering we have an FDA and a CDC. But I think that it's extremely problematic that because of the way that state governments and the federal government are choosing to regulate drugs in kind of a ad hoc manner and either not enforce the laws on the books and when they don't like the laws on the that aren't being enforced, rather than changing them, they have this kind of nip-tuck approach to it. And this is emblematic of that problem where you have local governments we are forcing to put in a situation to regulate the distribution of a drug that and make each individual municipality make a judgment call about whether or not certain compounds, certain drugs should be sold
in their jurisdiction. And that in and of itself, from a policy and a legal perspective and a regulatory perspective, is the worst case scenario, because not only is it extremely confusing for people out there, for consumers. Consumers should be able to walk into stores and buy things off of shelves without having to consult with an attorney as to whether or not what they're buying is legal. Secondly, when you do this weird ramshackle is it prohibited? Is it not? Is it a gray market? You completely ruin a chance for consumers to be educated about the potential risks or benefits of the product. And then thirdly, just from a business perspective, from a pure, America is a capitalist nation. When you have a company that's providing a legal service, they should be able to confidently provide that legal service and to make, so say, best case scenario for Kratom is it's harmless and the feds aren't going to come down on them and these state regulators are going to allow them to operate within the states. Then the regulatory lawyers people like you and I have to go to every municipality where this is an issue, and we have to have these completely scattershot, kind of mosaic approach to what we tell our clients and how to operate in each of these jurisdictions. So it's a mess, and it's got to be extremely expensive for these companies to hire lobbyists and lawyers to go into such a granular level on these policy issues.
I agree. What I'd like to see is sort of some nationwide model legislation dealing with this. But, we're going to get to see the Kratom Association in action because like we discussed earlier in this call, it's only going to take one adverse health effect for this to be right back on the headlines and to be the next For Loko or the next vaping crisis. So we'll see.
Shout out to the Kratom Association.
Right.
New members. And I'm sure because we've seen this just everywhere there's a new cannabis or new alcohol or new gaming legislation, the association always gets some calls. So I'm sure those guys get emails and calls constantly now. So speaking of shout outs, that's the end of our policy discussion for the week. We're going to do our weekly regulated shout outs. And my shout out of the week goes to now Chief of Staff Courtney Coppola over at the Florida Department of Health. Formerly Director Coppola was in charge of the Office of Medical Marijuana Use. She is now the Chief of Staff of the whole shebang over at the Department of Health, which is one of the largest state agencies in the state. And she will also be the coordinator over the medical marijuana program for the state. So she remains Florida's primary cannabis regulator. And in addition, she is now over an agency that does a tremendous amount of public health work, anything from patients with AIDS to community health to regulating medical cannabis. So we wish her the very best in the years to come.
Well, and I do like this trend where the frontline regulators are being promoted up to the secretary's office, because we've seen that happen both at Department of Health and at DBPR this year. So this is a good time to be a regulator in terms of promotional opportunities. Great. Well, I just want to say a word to the National Association of Licensing and Compliance Professionals. They're a group of liquor licensing legal professionals, consultants, service providers, government representatives, and state and national restaurant association folks. Glover Law, my firm, is a member. And when you hear this podcast, I will be at their annual conference in Denver with over 300 other folks. So I'm looking forward to seeing everybody from NowCap in Denver. And if you're listening to this, for some reason, while you're on a jog in Denver, come by and say hello. I'll be in the conference all week.
Yeah, let's get some podcasts recorded out at the conference.
I am bringing my microphone. So if you listen to this and it's October 15th or so, send me a DM and we can do a podcast.
Nice.
Well, good deal. I think that's it this week for Regulated, Christian.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Regulated. You can find us at regulatedpod.com or Regulated Pod on Twitter. Also, remember to subscribe and comment on our podcast wherever you are listening to our podcast. It helps us show up. It helps people find us. And as always, we thank you for listening again this week. And I'll turn it over to you, Tony.
Yeah, until next time, it doesn't matter whether you have good regulations or bad regulations. Just please try to stay in compliance.